Welcome to Keto Life Support, where we make your keto life sustainable, fun, and low stress. I'm Kim Howerton, and I'll be coming to you weekly with some of my keto besties to bring you the practical, real-world keto advice that you need. Quick disclaimer, I am not a doctor, and even if we do have a doctor in the house from time to time, he or she is not your doctor, and nothing we say on this show should be taken as medical advice. Always check in with a trusted medical professional about your own personal medical concerns. Hello and welcome to Keto Life Support. This is your host, Kim Howerton, and this is show number 49. I am super excited about this for multiple reasons. One, 49 is in fact my favorite number because it's 7 times 7, right? I mean, come on. Well, then the second part is I have perhaps one of the most exciting guests on today to me and to my fellow geeks. Dr. Benjamin Bickman is on today's show. If you don't know who Benjamin Bickman is yet, you should. So let me tell you a little bit. He is a professor at Brigham Young University. He's also the director of their diabetes research lab. His studies focus specifically on insulin, including its role as a regulator of human metabolism, as well as insulin's relevance in chronic disease. And his must-read book on insulin and its effect on health is called Why We Get Sick. If you have not read it, I really recommend it. And additionally, he helps the low-carb community with endeavors like Insulin IQ, which is a coaching and teaching platform that you can find online, as well as his new nutritional company, which is called Health Code. And they make keto-friendly meal replacement shakes. We talk a bit about them on the show so you can learn more about them. And I'm so pleased to have him on the podcast. He's really, honestly, one of my very favorite speakers due to his ability to really communicate complex topics in a clear and understandable way. I hope you enjoy this podcast. I know I did. And I know just like every time I hear him interviewed, you'll be like, why didn't she ask this other question? There were so many questions to ask. So if you end up having some questions that we skipped that you'd like to hear about, please let me know and I'll see if I can entice him to come back for another round. Take care and enjoy the episode. I am so excited to be here with Dr. Ben Bickman. How are you doing?
Hey, I am doing really well. Thank you. This is going to be a fun conversation. I already know it.
We know each other a little bit from previous keto conferences, and it's always been like you've always been a tear the house down speaker. Just, I think talking to college students a lot really helps.
Yeah, it definitely, when you have to entertain 150 20-year-olds for several hours a week, it definitely hones the craft.
Yeah. And also just like so many people are used to hearing doctors or researchers get up and like just download a bunch of very long words. And it can be very refreshing to hear from someone who realizes like translation might be needed.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, again, it really is something that I credit having to teach undergraduate courses. But you see this in a bigger academic setting. When I go to actual international science meetings, where the whole meeting is nothing but pure science from beginning to end, you can really tell a difference in those investigators, those scientists that are up speaking, whether or not they have some sort of university-related teaching obligation as well as part of their job, because you just have to learn how to keep the audience or the students engaged, be able to think of analogies cleverly and be able to know when you've gone too far and when to sort of take a step back and then rephrase something you just mentioned.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you got into studying insulin specifically. Why?
Yeah. So during my master's degree, I had been focusing on muscle and the degree to which fitness and running would influence inflammation. I was just, inflammation at the time was a topic of growing interest. I was interested in it because of what might be happening at the lungs as people are getting more fit. And lungs are loaded with macrophages, which are not pro-inflammatory. They are immune-related cells, so very much parts of the immune system. But at that same time, I found an article that had been published a few years prior that detailed this phenomenon where wherein fat cells were producing pro-inflammatory cytokines, not just the macrophages in the fat tissue, of which there are many, but the individual fat cells themselves. And that was such a revelation to me, because not only did it at the time reveal to me, although it had been known to others, that fat cells are endocrine organs actively secreting hormones that will go around the body and tell distant parts of the body what to do, but that they also contributed to inflammation. And this was so fascinating because it started to connect obesity to perhaps every other disease, but most especially type 2 diabetes. So the link to explain why is it that gaining weight is increasing so dramatically the risk of type 2 diabetes, it was through inflammation. And of course, insulin resistance is a part of that, because type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance at its extreme end. And that interest, that was the seed that was planted during my master's degree, that was a sufficient stimulus that I knew I wanted to study insulin resistance and inflammation during my doctoral work. And so I found a lab that allowed me to do that. And then I continued to do more of the same for the next few years in my postdoctoral fellowship. So that interest in insulin was certainly humble beginnings. It's still indeed a humble effort in and of itself, but it's an interest that has not waned. It has only grown, especially during my time as a new scientist with my own lab over the last 10 years and a professor teaching future medical practitioners. That's my primary undergraduate assignment. Teaching is to teach nursing students and pre-med students, and to be able to bring in my unique view of the relevance of metabolic health and chronic disease is very much a passion, not only personally and scientifically, but also professionally as a teacher. I want these future medical practitioners to see things to a degree the way, a washed up middle-aged scientist sees them.
I don't know. I'm a little older than you, so,
Yeah, so so if I'm washed up, then you got even further.
I know. I'm like, second chance at life. I mean,
Yeah.
So much of this stuff, it's like, it's mind blowing. I mean, when I got into the keto world, it was mind blowing to me. Like, I was diagnosed with PCOS, which is an insulin related condition, when I was 15 years old. And no one said peep about insulin. And, I'm 100% sure that my doctor had no idea.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We only know what we've been taught, physicians included.
Yeah. And so I'm so excited that, specifically the audience that you're speaking to in classes, because laying that foundation, it's like once you have a peek into the arena that insulin matters in far more ways than just a type 1 diabetic being given some, that's a paradigm changer.
It sure is. Yeah. And so you're bringing that up is wonderful. So that was part of my evolution as a professor. Whereas prior to that appointment, which involved, of course, teaching, I only looked at insulin and insulin resistance through the lens of type 2 diabetes. And I had only recently learned of a growing connection between insulin resistance and Alzheimer's disease. But it really was my desperation as a new professor to try to play to my strengths and want to, basically, I asked myself, all right, I don't know much about liver pathologies. How can I talk about anything that I can speak about with some authority? And so I would just ask myself, well, to what degree does insulin resistance play a part in liver diseases? To what degree does insulin resistance play a part in other neurological diseases or cardiovascular diseases and disorders and related problems? And it just kept coming up. It just continued to be relevant. And that is certainly something I hope to impress upon students and the public in general. One, it is that insulin resistance is very likely contributing to whatever the chronic disease is that the person's worried about to some degree. I'm not saying it's the only single input that's driving this, but it is very much going to be a relevant part of the progression and origins of the disease. And that is good news, because unlike so many other things, this is one we can do something about very, very well. If you're worried about your chronically elevated insulin, well, the good news is that you can drop it exceedingly quickly with just some, pretty simple strategies. Yeah.
So, you mentioned that fat cells as an endocrine organ were kind of a new concept to you when you learn that, and it makes total sense. And we see that inflammation having just downstream effects throughout somebody's whole life while it's going on. One thing that I did have a question about, right? We know you gain weight, your fat cells get bigger and more numerous. And those are different conditions, but both, are happening in weight gain to some degree. I guess my question is, we start to lose weight. So some of those fat cells begin to empty, right? At what point does inflammation stop being a concern? Do you have to get to 25% body fat?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So unfortunately, it's a good question in part because there's no answer. So the degree to which really does mean it's good and it's out there and it's left open. So inflammation as it pertains to obesity is generally a matter of the former instance that you mentioned, where at the early stages of someone getting fat, there are two processes occurring typically. And that is hypertrophy, so the growth of each individual fat cell, and you'd mentioned that as the first. And then the second you'd mentioned is hyperplasia, where each individual fat cell doesn't need to get too big because we just recruit a new fat cell to help carry that fat burden. The latter process, hyperplasia, is not associated with any degree of inflammation. The former process, hypertrophy, is in fact a demonstrable source, a significant source of inflammatory proteins, or in other words, inflammation throughout the body. Now that matters because you can have two people who do get fat through these two distinct mechanisms. Most people have hyperplasia throughout their childhood and puberty years. And then once puberty has ended, which is late teens in girls, early 20s in boys typically, then the number of fat cells is done. Adipose hyperplasia has stopped. And then forever after, the only growth that happens with regards to the size of someone's fat tissue is going to be through hypertrophy. And that is the most common. The vast majority of individuals, including people who are considered obese, they get fat through hypertrophy of the fat cells, which is, as I stated, the more inflammatory or the more disease-inducing method of getting fat. And so we have inflammation and insulin resistance and all those cardiometabolic problems that follow. However, there is a sliver of the population, and this is around 15% of people who become classified as obese. So this is a very narrow group, but they have the ability to experience fat growth through hyperplasia. And so what it means basically is that they have an almost limitless potential to get fat. That's, of course, a miserable situation for the individual, whereas the individual growing through hypertrophy, the fat cells can only get so big. And so the person will get fat, and it may be significantly fatter than is ideal or they want to be, but then they'll generally stop. It's virtually impossible to get any fatter, in part because the fat cells start to become insulin resistant and start leaking their fat at the same rate they're pulling it in. So no more storage overall, or at least not a net gain in storage. But with hyperplasia, you can always make more fat cells. And so paradoxically, they can get profoundly overweight and have an incredible fat mass, and yet have virtually no inflammation and no insulin resistance. So metabolically speaking, in that very narrow range, they actually appear to be quite healthy. Now, there's nothing healthy about being 350 or 400 pounds, but just in this narrow context of inflammation and insulin resistance, they would look like their blood levels, the blood labs in this regard would look like they're healthy marathon runners.
Got it. I've heard you mention this before, and there are these terrible guilty pleasure TV shows like 1,000-Pound Sisters and things where they show these people, and I thought, oh, I wonder if those people.
That's them.
Yeah.
So the average person just could not, under any circumstances, get that big. It would just be impossible. It wouldn't matter how much they're eating. The body would be storing fat in other places. None of this would be good. They'd be profoundly sick with profound diabetes and heart disease and everything else, but they simply could not get that fat.
Right. They couldn't get maybe above 350, 400.
That's right.
Yeah, got it. Okay. So from what I understand, right, when we get this hypertrophy, you've got the maxed out fat cells, you lose some body fat and they're not maxed out anymore, right? Like within some period of time.
That's right.
And so they're not leaking and putting as many damaging inflammation things in your bloodstream.
Yes, that's right. So as someone is losing weight, the individual fat cells start to shrink, and this allows them to become insulin sensitive again. And they stop releasing pro-inflammatory proteins because as all the fat cells start to shrink, they start to get closer and closer to all of the resident capillaries or blood vessels. Because I didn't mention this, but that's really the origins or the suspected origins of why the hypertrophic fat cells become pro-inflammatory. It's because they become hypoxic. They are pushing each other further and further away from the blood vessels, from the capillaries, and now they can't get oxygen and exchange CO2 and numerous other things. And so they start to release these pro-inflammatory proteins, some of which are supposed to be helping create new capillaries to try to resolve this hypoxia or this oxygen deficiency. And so as you start to shrink the fat cells, now they've all gotten closer again to the capillaries, and they don't need to be attempting to grow new blood vessels through the actions of some of these pro-inflammatory proteins.
Got it. So if somebody, say, was on a low carb diet, had lost 100 pounds, and they went to their doctor and they got a high sensitivity CRP, which is a blood marker of inflammation, and they were like, it's still high. And their doctor said, well, it's probably because you're overweight. Is it likely that, or should they seek out other causes? Like, could it still be that after 100 pounds of fat loss?
Oh yeah, for sure. It would just, it's all relative. It would just depend where they started.
Okay.
So I can't say definitively. I would expect that it will have come down, that it would have come down significantly. But if it's still above a healthy range, whatever that may mean, then I would say it's either because the fat cells are still relatively big, or two, that there's a completely separate entity or input that is driving this all together, like a food that they're eating that they don't know that they have a sensitivity to, for example.
Got it. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about, it's like, oh, I get such an excitement over insulin. We're geeky in this keto world when we get excited to talk about insulin. But a lot of people go out and for the first time ever, they start getting their fasting insulin tested when they're keto or low carb. And it comes back in at a number, and they don't know what it was before, so they don't know where it's come from. But you know, I've heard you say, and it seems to be the consensus, that really getting that fasting insulin down to 5 or 6 is a good range. Why is that? Why do we want to get it that low?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually think that having chronically elevated insulin, that is really the heart of the matter when it comes to the dangers associated with insulin resistance. So having a low fasting insulin is incredibly relevant, I believe, to longevity and health in general. That number, at least to me, and I know others have come around that same range, which is encouraging, that's based on 2 general lines of evidence. Firstly, if you look across different populations in the world, that ends up being a good kind of middle ground. The average American has a fasting insulin of around 9. This was a number of years ago. I'm sure it's higher by now, especially in the wake of COVID, where there's such incredible weight gain that's happened over this time. So the average is 9. And someone would say, well, that's fine. And I would counter and say, well, 88% of these adults are metabolically unfit. That's a statistic that we know within the United States. And so if 9 microunits per mil insulin is considered the average American is metabolically unfit. That to me is not a good number. In contrast, when we look at indigenous people, regardless of what they're eating, and I know there's deep debate in scrutinizing what they eat, we know that they don't eat what we eat. We also know they do not have cardiometabolic problems. And their fasting insulin in these populations, of course, there are fewer and fewer of them all the time, is 4 microunits per mil. And so 6 ends up being a nice kind of middle range in that regard. Now, a separate study published from the University of Arizona, they found that the difference between women who had a fasting insulin of 6 and those who had a fasting insulin of 8 was that those with the fasting insulin of 8 had a significantly, like a 40 or 50% increase in the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, even though that was just a couple points away from each other. So that, again, lends me some confidence in that number.
Got it. I've heard you say, and I've seen this in studying, that if there's sort of like a threshold, right? Your insulin through the day will go up and down depending on when you've eaten, how much you've eaten, what you've eaten. And you can kind of almost chart that there'll be times you're burning fat and times you're not burning fat. You're in more storage and release mode. And that line seems to be in the low teens, right?
Yep.
So the time you can spend with your insulin close to your fasting insulin level is the time that can kind of throw open the fat cell doors and allow that to come out.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, well said. Very well said. So insulin, like every single hormone, has its own rhythm throughout the day, or in some instances, it's longer than a day with its regard to its rhythms. But yeah, insulin will naturally have it will have an ebb and a flow to it, like so many hormones do. That's why when I hear someone who's gotten their fasting insulin and they said, well, it was 12, and I'll say, well, that's actually still in a pretty decent range, because it could be you might have caught it at a peak. And I'll say to them, then it's time to look at a different marker. And that's when I typically will mention the triglyceride to HDL ratio, because it is a fairly accurate indicator of insulin sensitivity, although not across all ethnicities. There's some loss of fidelity with that signal. But in the majority of Americans, at least, which is to say Caucasians, that number will be pretty tight, in that if the triglyceride to HDL ratio is less than 1.5, that's a good sign. And then I would say if someone had a fasting insulin of 12, but their triglyceride to HDL ratio was 1, and if it's 1, I would say regardless of ethnicity, if it's 1, that's a good number. What tends to happen is that in other ethnicities, so if we compare Caucasian cohorts against African cohorts, the African cohort can tend to have it a little higher. So the cutoff wouldn't be 1.5 like with Caucasians, it can be 1.8 or something like that. That's generally the way it moves. So regardless, if someone had a fasting insulin of 12, but they had a triglyceride to HDL ratio of 1, I would say you're okay. That triglyceride to HDL ratio is a good ratio, suggesting that you're insulin sensitive, in fact, well within that range. And the fact that your insulin is a little higher than I would say is ideal is okay. You probably just cut it at a peak.
Yeah. Even fasted, there can be reasons perhaps one day or another your insulin might be, you didn't sleep well, right? Like certain things can happen, right? Do you ever bring C-peptide into the conversation?
Yeah, I do. Although I think people who describe it, there are some people I know and for whom I have a great deal of respect who speak about C-peptide with in different terms than I do. So C-peptide is not a reliable marker of insulin to my knowledge, and that does include publications that state as much, although there may be papers that state otherwise. So I'm willing to give anyone the benefit of the doubt in that regard. But to my knowledge, C-peptide is not a good indicator of insulin levels because it has such very different half-lives. These two molecules, C-peptides just simply stay in the blood at different rates and different levels than insulin does. So I don't think C-peptide has value as an actual marker of insulin levels, but it has tremendous value as a marker of insulin production. And that's because for every one insulin molecule you make from the beta cell of the pancreas, you do release a C-peptide as well. Now, again, the rates at which they stay in the blood are not equal. Their production is equal, but their removal from the blood is not. That's why you can't look at it as a perfect surrogate or even an accurate surrogate. However, it is a marker that you're producing insulin at all. And that becomes relevant in a few unique clinical situations that I'm aware of that are quite rare, but nevertheless can happen. So to me, again, C-peptide is an indicator of the beta cells just producing insulin at all, and perhaps not a good indicator of the actual amount of insulin you have in the blood.
Okay. Because I've always sort of heard and looked at it like if you have a high C-peptide, it's telling you that even if you have a lower fasting insulin, throughout the day, you're potentially producing a lot of insulin. So you might see higher postprandial insulin than somebody who has a low C-peptide. I don't know but if you're telling me that
that's a good point.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point. I don't know what the ranges are for C-peptide, but I would think if someone's always coming in with really high C-peptide levels, that is without a doubt suggesting that insulin production is high. And maybe in this instance, the person has sufficient muscle mass or even fat cells to be binding to the insulin. And once the insulin is bound to its receptor, it's typically done. It binds to its receptor, it gets taken into the cell and then degraded through specific insulin degrading enzymes, especially the liver. And in that regard, even the health of the liver, independent of anything else, would play a strong role in removing insulin because the liver is the main site of insulin removal.
Got it. Okay. So it might have potential use in terms of being able to analyze if someone is, the way that they're eating might be causing postprandial rise.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think a high C-peptide would simply just lead to a growing suspicion that something's wrong, not that it would itself represent the kind of differential diagnosis.
Got it. So one thing I was just thinking about the HDL issue is I've run into a lot of people who, well, not a lot is exaggeration. I've run into some people who seem to have what I would call maybe genetically low HDL, and then others who seem to have genetically high HDL. I guess those are just going to be outliers in the trig to HDL ratio.
Yeah, they would. And unfortunately, I don't really know too much about that.
Okay.
So I would think if the degree to which that is real, that some people just naturally do have higher or lower levels, and that stands to reason that it would absolutely be possible, then the utility of the triglyceride to HDL ratio probably would start to fall apart.
But I guess you would know that if you're like, why the heck is my HDL this way? So you would just know not to pay attention. Okay.
Yeah. So in that case, though, Kim, I think that there would still perhaps be value in a prospective analysis. So whatever they were at 0.0, is it getting in the right direction at 0.1 and 2 and 3 and whatever the follow-ups are? So while the actual cutoffs may vary, I still think the direction should persist in having value.
Got it. So this is a common story. This is, I guess, you attract what you're like. And this was kind of my story. So, but I hear it a lot, which is people go on keto, their insulin starts to come down, they lose 50 pounds, and then they stop seeing any progress in terms of fat loss. Maybe they got 50, 40, 30 pounds they still want to lose. They're still doing what they were doing in terms of the insulin is improving. I know you're a researcher, not like a weight loss expert, but what do you think is happening there? Why the switch? Why the flip?
Yeah, that is a great question. And in fact, I remember talking about this with you.
You did.
Like 3 years ago or so. And I didn't have a great answer then. And I don't think I still do, but maybe it's a little more nuanced than it used to be. But firstly, I don't know. If someone is losing weight on a low carbohydrate diet, that is, so let me step back. I believe weight loss in general and actually improvements in insulin sensitivity can be viewed through two simple lenses. On one hand, it is just a matter of energy, in other words, calories. On the other hand, insulin. Some people, because I am an advocate of scrutinizing insulin and believe that insulin is absolutely relevant in the growing and shrinking of fat cells, and I don't truly know how anyone can feel otherwise, because I'm an advocate of viewing insulin, someone would say, oh, well, Ben doesn't think calories matter. I absolutely do. Energy must be accounted for. I just think if we overlook the relevance of insulin, we're missing out on a potentially valuable lever that we can be manipulating in this strategy. So insulin tells the body what to do with energy. It tells the body what to do with calories. Specifically, it tells fat cells what to do with calories. So on one hand, we have a strategy that just says, don't worry about the energy, look at the insulin. That works. There's no question that someone does not have to pay any attention to energy itself. Right. They know by just scrutinizing what's going to happen to their insulin, they will lose weight. Conversely, you can have someone who has no regard for their insulin, and if they bring their energy down enough, they will lose weight. Now, I still believe when it comes strictly to insulin sensitivity, and this is based on data that have put people on isocaloric diets. So you clamp energy, and now you've only really shifted the insulin. This group, the insulin controllers, will become more insulin sensitive, and very often they will lose more weight. There are multiple studies to show that, although there are multiple studies to show no weight difference. But the net effect of that would suggest that there is a benefit. So back to this specific situation. Once someone has reached a plateau with the low-carb diet, and that's the insulin-centric paradigm, and they are not where they want to get, I would say that does not refute the insulin paradigm, because it's possible that their insulin has stopped lowering as well. Now, you probably actually do know more about that than me, just because of your interaction with specific individuals, and I only can rely on the data. I'm unaware of data that shows once someone has plateaued, that their insulin continues to go down. Have you seen that happen?
It's a matter of degree. Like for me, during my plateau, my 2-year plateau, which was exciting, my insulin went from 8, then it went to 6, then it went to 5. And it stayed at 5. I seem to stay at 5. I don't really seem to go.
Yeah, well, that's a very, very good number.
Below 5.
So once someone has really turned down the insulin through low carbohydrate diet, I think the only other strategy then is to start controlling the energy. Yeah. Now, I realize what that means, and someone's eye rolling and they're thinking, well, great, then I'm just kind of low calorie and I'm going hungry. I do think that part of the value in dietary protein is that I do not think it's an energy. I don't think it is, of course, in absolute terms, but the body does not use protein as an energy source in all but the most extreme circumstances. And so protein, which depending on the context will have a very modest insulin effect if it's low carb, it also accelerates metabolic rate itself. Just eating protein has a higher, what's called a thermic effect. So it just costs more energy just to digest and absorb those amino acids in the first place. And so at that point, I think really focusing on protein, and this I will give credit to Ted Naiman for his very outspoken advocacy of that view. I think that view starts to have a very practical relevance when you start to control energy. But I do not think it needs to be or even ought to be the first step. I think if you focus on energy too soon, then you are creating such a tedious way of eating. I would worry that you're almost doomed to fail. You told my punchline. Actually, I haven't told you this, but I lost 30 pounds last year after my stall by increasing the protein and being more energy conscious. And what's interesting is eating in a way, what you said is so important. If I tried to eat the way I eat now, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when I started keto, I would never have done it. I had to reach a point where my insulin was lower. I was fat adapted, like a lot of things in my metabolism had improved, in my hormones had improved. And now that was the problem, right? You get to this place where you're like, I am now metabolically healthy, but I am still fluffy. What lever do I pull now? And so I think that with low carb, with insulin, like it's very important to start out from a place of focusing on, hormonal response and hunger and that kind of thing. But what I'm finding for my clients and for myself is for a lot of people, the now what? Like I got metabolically healthy. Now what? Is a prioritizing protein, like a doubling down on that and finding that there can be some light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah. In fact, there is an interesting study that actually scrutinized the degree of weight loss in individuals who were insulin sensitive or insulin resistant, but both groups overweight. And the insulin sensitive group was able to lose weight through either the low carb diet or the low fat diet. However, the insulin resistant group, they lost an insignificant amount of weight on the low fat diet, but it was the low carb diet where they had significant improvements. And so I think we have to look at someone perhaps as going through this evolution. And just like you said, at the front end of this, if they're overweight, they're likely insulin resistant. The evidence suggests they're going to respond better to a low carb diet. And then they're more insulin sensitive or outright insulin sensitive, but still have more fat than they want. Well, then now the caloric centric paradigm or strategy may have greater value.
Right. We're singing the same song. So I'm very
good.
It's awesome. I did have some questions about protein. I'm going to check my notes so I make sure that I read them. I am a big fan now at this point of protein. But what happened when I first started keto 5 years ago? It was like the dark age. It was a long time ago in keto. People were very, very concerned about protein and gluconeogenesis and all that. What you've said, I think in your book, Why We Get Fat. Not your book.
Gary Taub's book, which is a wonderful book. Yeah, Gary's is Why We Get Fat. Mine's Why We Get Sick. And I love it. If people mistake the two, I'm flattered. Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense why protein on a low carb diet would cause too much insulin and like you can't do both.
Yep.
And so we were all very concerned about gluconeogenesis at the beginning. And I'm 5'9", and I was eating less than 65 grams of protein a day. And when I first started, and then fairly soon, like a little while after, I started learning more about protein and what it can do. And I bumped it up because I was like, I don't think that's good. But I was warned a lot, like, no, keep the protein as low as you possibly can. But in more recent days, one of the things that I've really looked at is like muscle protein synthesis and anabolic resistance. Like as we age, we need more protein to actually get the amount of protein we think we're getting. And so my question on that is, do you think that protein is villainized still?
Hearing your example or your personal situation is interesting because when I first became involved in the low carb community, and I don't mean the science of ketogenic diets, because my evolution as a scientist, I became more interested in ketogenic diets before I was ever aware of a low carb community. And then it was me speaking at a low carb Breckenridge event probably 5 years ago at this point, the very first time ever. And so that was the beginning of me being exposed to the low carb community. And that was the beginning of me hearing people say, well, you got to eat less protein because protein will stop. It'll bump up insulin and it will inhibit ketogenesis. And I just thought that was the most remarkable paradigm. Not that it didn't, strictly speaking, and context dependent, protein can elicit a mild to significant increase in insulin. In context being, if you eat protein with carbohydrate, which in nature almost never comes together, then you will amplify the insulin response to that carbohydrate alone. So there is some relevance to that. And I think its origins are from the strict ketogenic diets of children who needed to maintain very high levels of ketosis in order to prevent their epilepsy. But again, the degree to which the protein needs to be cut or not, I think ought to be debated, even in that context of epilepsy. But still,
I hear that they're now actually putting kids more often on a what they call modified Atkins, which is a much higher protein approach. It's still working to control seizures.
That's right. That's exactly right. So I do think that we're evolving past that old-fashioned view of protein. But even in the strict realm of low-carb diets, the legends of ketogenic diets are Steve Phinney and Jeff Volek. And if you actually go back to many of their human trials that they've done, when you look at the actual amount of protein and fat, it comes close to a 70-30-ish. That's about what fat and protein, that's the calorie breakdown if you put fat and protein together in a 1-to-1 ratio. And so it ends up being really close to that 70-30, 70% of calories from fat, 30% from protein. And that is what I think where we should be. And so my talk that I gave at Low Carb Breckenridge a few years ago now about protein and the relevance of glucagon and insulin in context of low carb diet or high carb diet, it was all in an effort to address what I thought was an unhealthy pattern of eating in the context of a low carb diet, which was just go hog wild on fat. I mean, it was people just literally eating tablespoons of MCT. And I thought, this is bizarre. There may be sure a metabolic benefit to MCT, but there's no nutrition to this. And so I worried that people were avoiding what I would consider the most nutritious foods, which is meat and eggs. And so I wanted to make a contribution in a way to that concern, or to address that concern by looking at the available data. And the sum of it to me was that if someone is afraid, or if someone wants to keep their insulin in control, I agree with that view. That's certainly part of my dietary strategy. Then the degree to which protein influences this, as I've already stated, really depends on the degree to which you're also increasing your glucose. Because if you're eating protein and glucose is low, or you're not eating any other glucose, then the insulin effect will be there, but it'll be very modest, and it will be matched, or it will have an even greater subsequent release of glucagon, which is insulin's opposite in many regards.
Right. One of the things that I've seen, like from Don Layman's lab, in Chicago, I believe, or Illinois, who is a protein researcher, that when they studied diets at 30% protein there was a profound difference in populations that were losing weight in terms of the distribution of that weight loss, that under eating protein in a weight loss context or a fat loss desiring context can lead to the loss of lean mass at a greater rate than you'd want. People talk about keto or producing ketones as being anti-catabolic, right? So there's an idea that if you're in ketosis, it'll be muscle sparing. So a lot of people defend low protein by saying, but it's okay, I'm in ketosis, so I won't lose.
That's a mistaken view. So people will say ketones are muscle sparing, and that will lead to them to kind of defend low protein because they'll say, well, my ketones are protecting my muscle. Yeah. That is not true. Ketones are muscle sparing in the sense that if you have enough fat to make ketones, then you have enough energy to feed the brain to make up for the relative reductions in glucose. If the ketones aren't there, or rather when you start to run out of fat, then the brain is forced to start cutting the proteins from the muscle to turn them into glucose, to basically break down muscle protein and convert those proteins into glucose to feed the brain. So if you have enough fat to make ketones, even if you're starving, you are sparing the muscle. That is the difference between a fast and starvation, where if you have a very overweight individual and they fast for 300 days, they aren't losing muscle during this phase because they have ample fat tissue to create ample ketones to make up for the relative reduction in glucose and glucose that the brain can use. It fills that energy gap, and then the body has no need to start cutting muscle to create glucose to feed the brain. The ketones are already doing it. That is why ketones are muscle sparing.
Got it. So potentially, if you're under eating protein while energy restricted in such a way as you're trying to lose body fat, you might be more inclined to lose muscle mass even on a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, one of my worries about low calorie diets is that if you are really low calorie, if you are losing weight through, kind of like semi-starvation, you're eating 1,000 calories a day, you will start to lose lean mass as well, simply because muscle and bone are metabolically expensive tissues, and that would have nothing necessarily to do with needing to feed the brain. It would just be that your body senses that it's starving, and so why not start cutting muscle and bone because you just got to live.
Right. So so one of my concerns is because I run into a lot of women, mostly women, not as many men. I'm sure there are other men, but I talk to mostly women who have been keto for years. They still want to lose 30 pounds. They're eating 900 calories a day and, 4 grams of carbohydrate, and they keep cutting their carbs and, and they're just in this just sort of downward spiral.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing I did have a question. You talk about protein not being a great fuel, right? It is a structural element, but there are some approaches, right? You mentioned Ted Naiman, where protein might be as much as 50% for some people. Does it partially become? Because if it's Yeah, for sure. So my comment is that you only use protein in the most extreme circumstances. If you're getting 50% of your calories from protein, that is an extreme circumstance. I would say that's an incredibly unique way of eating. And I want to be delicate because I don't mean to, poo-poo that whole idea. But yes, in that sense, when 50%-ish or more of your calories is coming from protein, especially if so much of what else you're eating is fiber, which has no caloric value, and fiber is directly challenging the absorption of glucose. So that may be giving you even less glucose than you think as a fuel. Yes, you would absolutely be converting those proteins into glucose in the liver, those amino acids into glucose. But I would still consider that an extreme circumstance. Okay. So I've heard you talk about this kind of mystical 1-to-1 ratio, right? Of fat to protein in terms of grams, because in nature, that's what we tend to find. I also interestingly heard you mention something about it being beneficial for muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah. That is such a fascinating finding. So there is human studies to find that if you have someone work out and you take a muscle biopsy and you measure the degree to which the muscle is making protein, if they work out, the muscle starts to make a little more protein, muscle protein synthesis. So another way of saying that is the muscle gets a little bigger. When someone eats protein, the muscle gets a little bigger beyond just the workout alone. Now, we have then two divergent possibilities. If we then have protein with carbohydrate, we see no muscle growth beyond the protein alone. So the carbohydrate and the subsequent greater insulin release does nothing to stimulate any greater muscle growth. However, when you couple that protein with fat, which, as you said, is how we get it in nature, all the best proteins come with fat in nature. You do, in fact, get an additive effect. What the protein did with regards to muscle growth, protein and fat does even better. So it pushes the muscle growth beyond that. That is very likely a specific effect at the muscle cell. There's something essential about those fats, and that's not surprising to me, because if you're making a cell bigger, it's the protein inside that's pushing the muscle cell to get bigger. But you need, as the membrane of the cell gets bigger, you need fat. Cell membranes are made of fat predominantly. So I wouldn't be surprised if that added fat is serving a very direct benefit to the growing muscle cell itself. But also, one of the oft overlooked aspects is that when you eat fat with protein, you digest protein better. It's a little known fact, too little known, that bile acids, which are released with fat consumption, actually enhance proteolytic enzymes in the intestines, facilitating protein digestion. This is why I'm convinced most people who just get their protein from protein shakes, where they will just take a scoop of whey protein, and whey protein is a wonderful protein, but in nature, you'd never get the protein alone. And so they drink a whey shake and they say, well, I can't have whey. It upsets my stomach. I'm always quick to say, well, what happens when you eat it with some fat? And it's surprising how frequently people have no problem with it.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up shakes, because I want to talk a little bit about them. Early on in my keto days, I've grown, but early on in my keto days, right? I had heard basically that whey shakes were the devil, because they would raise your insulin, and became very concerned about the use of shakes. Now, I still have some concerns, honestly, about the use of shakes, because I'm a sort of whole foods advocate and think there's benefits from chewing and lots of different things. But, one of the things that I'd looked at early on, there seems to be some backing to this in studies, that because of the speed of digestion potentially of a shake, especially a whey shake, it can cause more of an insulin response than, say, an egg white protein or eating a plate of egg whites, which are nutritionally similar, but seem to be absorbed differently. Are we splitting hairs? Should anyone be concerned about that different insulin effect?
Yeah, so I don't think so. No, I don't. So the degree to which, a given mass of whey would have a very slightly different effect on insulin than a given mass of, say, egg white, that is going to be modest. However, I think it is appropriate very much to scrutinize the whey shake itself. One, because whey isn't supposed to come alone. Protein is supposed to come with fat. But two, often those whey shakes have much more in them than people would suspect, including just even fillers like maltodextrin, or other forms of just what becomes pure glucose. So I do think it's very appropriate to scrutinize these shakes, and even the artificial sweeteners that may be used. There are things that I think are relevant to most, protein shakes, and even many meal replacement shakes at the same time.
Right. So recently you came out, or you were a part of developing a shake company, right? Maybe it'll be more than that, but a company. I actually have some shake pack. I tried it. So the company's called Health Code, and there are 2 flavors right now, and I tried them both, and they're delicious. But one of the things that I noticed when I read the back is it's got a lot of stuff in it, all of which is a good thing. Like, it's not just one type of protein, it's a blend. And it's unusual for a protein shake, because it's not just a protein shake, I guess. It's a complete meal. It says there's fat in here.
Yeah. So this was born from a conversation with one of my older brothers. Now, I have a lot of older brothers, but one of them in particular had been working in the nutrition space for years, probably 20 years. And he had just grown very tired with it. And he knew that I had been kind of nagging him for years, saying, Joel, we've got to just do something on our own. And partly it's because I guess a few things went into this from my end as a scientist. when you think you have answers to scientific questions, you want to translate that into solutions to lifestyle problems. And when someone adopts a low carbohydrate diet, one of the good things about that is they're forced to eat more real food, which is something you touched on. I like that. I think it's a good thing. I think it's a strength of a low carbohydrate diet, just because there aren't a lot of easy, convenient foods that are low carb. So you've got to take the time to prepare more meals. I think that's a wonderful aspect. At the same time, I think there's something to be said for, look, I've just got to get out the door, or I don't really have time to plan and prepare this meal. And so I'm just going to, then a shake in that sense just becomes super convenient. That was part of the impetus for a shake. And then it was finally my view that it just hadn't quite been done up to my standards at this point. There is another good shake I can think of, but the way they package it makes it so much more expensive. And so we wanted to have a shake. As I spoke with my brother, he handled the nuts and bolts, and I just said, let me design the shake. And it was what we came up with. And it's certainly something I'm proud of. But you're right. It does have a unique blend of fats and a unique blend of proteins with a handful of extras, but built on that 1-to-1 ratio of protein to fat.
Do you really think that for everyone, do you think there are times in which someone might edge the protein higher than the fat to drive maybe additional weight loss? Or do you think pretty much staying 1-to-1 is the way most people need to stick?
That's a good question. To me, the 1-to-1 is, I would say it's optimal just because we see it so consistently in nature. But yeah, I think that if someone, like the situation you described earlier, where they've sort of evolved, where they're now insulin sensitive, and they've lost their first 50 and now want to cut off the final 20 or so, then perhaps, yes, increasing protein might be justified. But there's still a little part of me that worries, by cutting out the fat, are we losing some degree of satiety? And is there, because fat is...
Preach.
Yeah, fat is a satisfying food. And so I worry that when someone starts to eschew energy too much, especially at the expense of fat, just because it has more energy than glucose, gram for gram, then I do worry that that's going to lead them to potentially kind of start seeking fat in some way, shape, or form. So nevertheless, there's some nuance here, partly because I'm unaware of any answers to this specific question. I am a big advocate of that 1-to-1, which is roughly a 70-30 by calorie split, fat to protein. But I could see if someone edged the protein up a little higher, if it got to 35-65, or maybe even 40-60. That to me, however, is starting to, I just can't see how that would be
certainly not sustainable.
Enjoyable. I don't think it'd be enjoyable, because then you're just eating chicken breast. I mean, chicken breast is good if you have butter all over it. Then you're eating like the leanest meats, and that's just not, to me, it isn't good. Now, that's not scientific of me to say, I know.
Yeah, sure.
But at that point, to me, the enjoyment of eating I've started to lose it.
Got it. A lot of people have started saying to, target, even I've been saying this because it worked for me, but I'm willing to alter, to target around 1 gram of protein per pound of reference body weight or ideal body weight. And when you get the protein to that level, then if you try to meet it with fat to get to a 1-to-1, you might be finding energy-wise, you're higher than your energy needs are. So the question then becomes, should somebody bring their protein down a little bit to the lower end of the range, like 0.7?
Yeah, that's a good question. So 1 gram per pound is really high by my estimation. I think it should be more 1 or 1.5 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight. Okay. That, of course, changes it considerably. I am unaware of, to me, from what I understand, that 1.5-ish, maybe up into the high ones, gram of protein per kilogram, that's about the maximal benefit. That's a point of diminishing returns. At that point, you're not getting any more benefit from the protein with regards to maintenance or growth of lean mass. But maybe someone would say, yeah, but there's still that metabolic benefit, because protein is so different when it comes to other energy sources. So Yeah, I would say if someone's trying to base their macros off of 1 gram per pound, that is going to be hard to fit it all in. If I think they're basing it on 1 gram per kilogram of ideal body weight, then I think that's going to be much more doable.
Yeah, it becomes a different math equation completely.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I know we got to wrap it up soon. So just a couple last thoughts. So just to confirm, I think that one of the worst phrases that ever got in the vernacular was insulin spike, right? Like we got to a point where people fear insulin. I will sometimes hear from people, I can't eat this or that because I'm going to have an insulin spike. Do you think that the fear about whey protein falls under that as well? Like, obviously.
Oh, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. But I also think as much as I point the finger at insulin, I care less about an individual insulin spike than I care about the background insulin. So if someone has one insulin spike, let's say because they ate a bunch of meat and meat can increase insulin, I would say, who cares? That is inconsequential. What becomes a problem is when you're spiking insulin, basically spiking it again a couple hours later before it ever had a chance to get back down. So it's the incessant spiking of insulin that overall results in a mounting insulin resistance and thus the higher fasting insulin. So insulin's elevated at every single moment of night or day. So one individual spike in a 24-hour period or even two separated by several hours, I think that's going to be just fine.
Okay. And then I have some clients, not very many, but some clients who were type 2 diabetic and still have some of those tendencies. I've heard you discuss this concept of insulin resistant at the pancreatic level, sort of the alpha cell resistance, if you will, like the glucagon becomes resistant to insulin. Can you briefly touch on, so those are the only population I found that have to limit their protein to some degree.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's such a great question. I say that because it's one that we are just about to start answering in my lab. Where
great.
We are just starting a human study. We hopefully get approval from the university this month. We've been waiting for a few months to start this. It's actually a collaboration with a company called Levels Health. They're actually funding the project. But basically what we wanted to do was try to understand, why do some people with adoption of a low carbohydrate diet have a paradoxical rise in glucose or an inability of the glucose to come down? If you're cutting glucose from the diet, if your glucose was elevated, it should come down. Sometimes in some people it doesn't. In some instances, it even goes up. We are going to scrutinize all of the 3 macronutrients in these groups of people after we identify the kind of paradoxical responders and the typical or expected responders. And we're going to have them at different weeks. We will measure not only fasting levels of a battery of hormones, insulin, glucagon, catecholamines, cortisol, growth hormone, and more, but we'll look at those dynamic responses in response to pure glucose, pure fat, and pure protein, just to try to get an idea. In fact, what I suspect partly is the case is that some people are protein sensitive, and that when they're eating protein, they are getting an exaggerated glucagon response relative to insulin, and that then is driving up the glucose to be higher than expected. So there's no answer, and I hope to be able to contribute to that answer within the next few months.
Got it. Okay, last question. Sweeteners.
Yeah.
So many people are like, all sweeteners, cephalic insulin, like all these things get thrown around about sweeteners being an issue. Where do you stand on sweeteners? Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways to cut that. My general view is artificial sweeteners are fine, just because the vast majority of them are. Now, I do prefer natural sweeteners like monk fruit and stevia extract. They have absolutely no response, no insulin response whatsoever. Some of the other artificial sweeteners, like some of the ones that end in OL, like maltitol, for example, some of those do have insulin responses. Yeah. And of course, they can wreck your guts. In fact, it's to the point for me, I don't know whether it's always been this bad or it's just worse as I've gotten older. I just can't eat these sugar alcohol sweetened foods or treats because I just pay for it later. My intestines are so upset at me. So I'm a fan of the natural sweeteners, stevia and monk fruit, but even still, in general, I would say if someone's looking at them strictly through the lens of the insulin spike and intestinal bubbling be damned, then I would say they're fine. You're going to be fine with any of them for the most part.
Yeah, I tend to hear erythritol, monk fruit, and stevia seem to be the most well tolerated.
Yep. And even I will say, just to be fair, aspartame, despite its bad reputation, also is not going to do anything to your insulin.
Okay. So whether they work for you or not, behaviorally is one thing, but as an insulin person, you're like, I'm not worried about those on an insulin level. That's
right. And in fact, I credit to you for having that little preface in that statement. There are behaviors that could be triggered by just tasting something sweet at all. So I won't get into that, and I'm to a degree not really qualified. But the degree just to which it spikes insulin, I think you can safely assume it's going to be negligible or nothing.
Okay. So I want to wrap it up by just mentioning your incredible book again. And why we get sick goes a lot into, I mean, not to give the plot away, but there's some mention of insulin in there.
Yeah, a little.
A little bit. And so many interesting things are touched on that we don't have time for today, but how it affects thyroid, how it affects all sorts of things, all of the health repercussions of hyperinsulinemia. And so I really encourage everyone, everybody has, but if you haven't, read the book. One last thing that a question came in to me about was, they're familiar with the negative effects of having high glucose, right? Is there cell damage from just high insulin even before you get to high glucose?
Oh, my heavens, yes. In fact, there's so much so that question almost should be flipped. What is the actual damage from the elevated glucose? Because most of what we think is damaging in the context of type 2 diabetes is the elevated insulin itself. For example, there's not a single mechanism whereby, so almost every person with type 2 diabetes has hypertension. And that's a very significant contributor to why ultimately the diabetic will typically die from heart disease. The elevated glucose does nothing to hypertension. That is itself completely a phenomenon of the insulin resistance and the hyperinsulinemia in many aspects. The dementia, the Alzheimer's disease risk that you see with type 2 diabetes, that's not the elevated glucose, it's the elevated insulin and the insulin resistance of the hippocampus, resulting in compromised glucose use. The infertility in men or women, that's a result of the insulin, not the glucose. So I hope I'm making my case. Really, not that elevated glucose isn't pathogenic. It is. Chronically elevated glucose can hurt the kidneys, it can hurt blood vessels, and it can hurt nerves. Insulin resistance can also hurt all of those and far more.
Right. So encourage everybody to read the book. You also have an Audible version for people that like to listen instead of use their eyes, but it really deeply goes into a topic that I think far too many people don't understand. So Ben, where can people find out more about you if they want to go deeper?
Yep. Thanks so much. This was great. I'm fairly active on social media. I try to do a post or two a week, just little video snippets about human metabolism. And that's actually on Instagram. I first kind of grew my little social media brand on Twitter, and now I really can't stand Twitter anymore. So I've retreated to the more pleasant waters of Instagram instead. I regularly contribute blog content to the Get Health. That's the HLTH. That's or the health code website, gethealth.com. You can see some blog and video content as well as the shake itself. And Insulin IQ, where I do these live stream events as part of this coaching platform that we have.
Awesome. And I'll put all of that in the show notes. And I just want to throw in that your shake is one of the first shakes that I've ever had that I didn't think was too sweet, which is so important.
I agree. I felt the same way. Yep.
Yeah.
Glad to hear.
Okay. So thank you so much for joining me. I know we went a little over time, so I appreciate your patience with me. I'd love to do this again sometime. It was so much fun.
Oh yeah, this was great. Yes, we're great connecting with you again, Kim. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Ben. Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Keto Life Support. Want more information? Want show notes? Want to suggest a topic? Just head over to ketolifesupport.com. That's where all that kind of thing can go on. By the way, I have a request. If you could go to your podcast host and hit subscribe, we would really, really appreciate it. And what would be even more awesome is if you could write a review. And what would be even more awesome than that is if you could write like a really flattering review. Just asking, you do you. All right. So thanks so much